On the afternoon of January 22nd, 1879, the British Empire received a wound it would never forget. At Isandlwana, over 1,000 soldiers lay dead beneath the African sun, their bodies scattered across the veldt like broken toys. The greatest military power on earth had just suffered its worst defeat against an indigenous force in modern history. But the day was not over. 10 miles away, at a small Swedish mission station called Rorke's Drift, a handful of men were about to face the same storm that had just swallowed an army. They were barely 150. Farmers' sons, coal miners, clerks who had traded their civilian lives for redcoats and rifles. Against them marched 4,000 Zulu warriors, men in the prime of their lives, hungry for glory, their assegais still wet from the slaughter at Isandlwana. The British had no walls of stone, no artillery, no cavalry to ride for rescue. Only bags of grain, boxes of biscuits, and the stubborn will to survive. And then the Zulus came, wave after wave, crashing against the barricades like a black tide against a crumbling shore. Rifles cracked, bayonets thrust, men screamed. The hospital caught fire, its thatched roof blooming into a pillar of flame that painted the African night in shades of hell. Inside, soldiers hacked through walls with pickaxes, dragging wounded men through holes barely wide enough for a body, fighting hand to hand in smoke-filled rooms where death waited behind every door. The Martini Henry rifles grew too hot to hold. Ammunition ran low, and still the warriors came, climbing over their own dead to reach the defenders. When dawn finally broke over the Buffalo River, the mission station stood transformed into something unrecognizable. The walls were pocked with bullet holes and stained with blood. Bodies lay everywhere, British and Zulu alike, tangled together in the final embrace of combat. Smoke drifted across the silent battlefield. And in the center of it all, exhausted men in tattered red coats still stood at their posts, rifles ready, eyes hollow, alive against all odds. They had done the impossible. 150 men had held back 4,000. And the echo of that night would resound through the centuries as one of history's most desperate and heroic last stands. The road to Rorke's Drift began not in Africa, but in the drawing rooms of London, where men who had never felt the African sun decided the fate of a kingdom they barely understood. By the late 1870s, the British Empire stretched across the globe, painting the map in imperial red from India to Canada. But in the southeast corner of Africa, a problem had emerged that could not be solved with treaties or trade agreements. The Zulu kingdom, a military power that had dominated the region for half a century, stood directly in the path of British expansion. The Zulus were not a primitive people awaiting civilization. They were a nation forged in war, their military system perfected under the legendary King Shaka decades earlier. Every young man trained from childhood in the art of combat. Their regiments, called Amabuto, were organized by age and bound by fierce loyalty. They fought with the Iklwa, a short stabbing spear designed for close combat, and the Iwisa, a heavy club that could crush a skull with a single blow. Their tactics were sophisticated, employing the famous horns of the buffalo formation that encircled enemies with lethal precision. King Cetshwayo Kampande, who had ruled since 1873, was no fool. He understood that war with Britain meant the destruction of everything his people had built. He tried to negotiate, to maintain peace, while preserving Zulu independence. But Sir Bartle Frere, the British High Commissioner for South Africa, had other plans. Frere believed that the Zulu military system was incompatible with British interests in the region. In December 1878, he issued an ultimatum that was designed to be impossible to meet. The Zulus were given 30 days to disband their army and pay reparations for border incidents. When the deadline expired on January 11, 1879, British forces crossed the Buffalo River into Zululand. Lord Chelmsford, the British commander, was confident. He led the center column himself, some 7,000 men marching toward the Royal Kraal at Ulundi. He had cannons, rockets, and the Martini Henry rifle. A breech-loading weapon that could fire 12 rounds per minute with deadly accuracy at ranges exceeding 400 yards. Against spears and shields, he believed, European technology would prove invincible. He was catastrophically wrong. On the morning of January 22nd, while Chelmsford had divided his forces and taken half his men on a reconnaissance, a Zulu army of 20,000 warriors descended upon his camp at Isandlwana. The British were caught unprepared, their ammunition boxes proving difficult to open, their formations inadequate against the sheer numbers that surrounded them. Within hours, over 300 British and colonial soldiers were dead. It was a slaughter of such magnitude that it would haunt the British military for generations. But the Zulus who had achieved this stunning victory were not the only warriors on the field that day. The Undi Corps, some 4,000 men who had been held in reserve, had arrived too late to share in the glory of Isandlwana. They had marched 20 miles that morning, only to find the battle already won. Their commander was Prince Dabulamanzi Kampande, half-brother to King Cetshwayo, a man known for his aggression and his hunger for glory. Cetshwayo had given strict orders. The army was not to cross into the British colony of Natal. The war was to remain defensive, a message to the invaders that Zululand would not submit. But Dabulamanzi looked toward the Buffalo River, where the British had left a small garrison at a place called Rorke's Drift, and he saw an opportunity. His men had not whetted their spears. They were denied the honor of Isandlwana. And now, just 10 miles away, stood another British position, ripe for destruction. Against his king's explicit command, Dabulamanzi led his warriors across the river and into Natal. He would give them the glory they craved. He would complete the destruction of the British center column. He would prove himself worthy of the blood of kings. He had no way of knowing that his decision would lead to one of the most remarkable military stands in recorded history. The mission station at Rorke's Drift was an unlikely fortress. It consisted of 2 single-story buildings about 30 meters apart, one a hospital and one a storehouse. Built by a Swedish missionary named Otto Witt and originally belonging to an Irish trader named James Rorke. The buildings were simple structures with thatched roofs and mud brick walls, never designed to withstand assault. Around them stretched the African veldt, open and exposed, with a rocky hill called the Oscarberg rising to the south. The garrison left to defend this position was equally modest. B Company of the 2nd Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot, numbered about 80 men fit for duty. Added to them were a handful of soldiers from various other units, some Royal Engineers, a few men from the Army Service Corps, and about 100 members of the Natal Native Contingent, colonial troops of questionable reliability. In total, perhaps 150 men, of whom 35 lay sick or wounded in the hospital. Command fell to 2 young lieutenants who had never seen major combat. John Chard of the Royal Engineers was 31 years old, a quiet man who had arrived at Rorke's Drift only 3 days earlier to supervise the repair of pontoon bridges. Gonville Bromhead of the 24th Foot was 33, partially deaf, considered by his superiors to be a pleasant but unremarkable officer. Neither man had any reason to expect that January 22nd would be different from any other day. The first warning came in the early afternoon. Distant gunfire echoed from the direction of Isandlwana, miles away across the hills. No one knew what it meant. Then, around 3:30, 2 exhausted horsemen came galloping toward the mission, their horses lathered with sweat. They brought news that turned the blood cold. Isandlwana had fallen. The column was destroyed. Thousands of Zulu warriors were heading this way. Chard immediately consulted with Bromhead and a third man who would prove crucial to the defense, James Dalton, a former army sergeant now serving as acting assistant commissary. Dalton was a veteran, experienced and pragmatic. He quickly assessed their options. They could try to flee, but the hospital held patients too sick to travel, and the Zulus could easily run down a column burdened with wagons and wounded men. They could stay and fight, using the buildings and supplies as improvised fortifications. Dalton argued for defense. Chard and Bromhead agreed. With perhaps an hour before the Zulus arrived, the garrison transformed the mission station into a defensive position. The buildings were connected by walls of mealie bags, each weighing 200 pounds, stacked shoulder high. Biscuit boxes and crates of tinned meat formed additional barriers. Loopholes were smashed through the walls of the hospital and storehouse. Every able-bodied man worked with desperate speed, hauling, stacking, fortifying. knowing that their lives depended on what they could accomplish before the storm arrived. The Natal native contingent troops, seeing the approaching Zulu army, panicked and fled. Nearly 100 men simply ran, reducing the garrison by more than a third. Chard watched them go without comment. There was no time for anger, only preparation. By 4:30, the improvised fortress was as ready as it would ever be. The remaining defenders, now barely more than 100 men, took their positions behind the barricades. They checked their Martini Henry rifles and fixed their bayonets. They had about 20,000 rounds of ammunition. They had courage. They had each other. And they had no illusions about what was coming. The Undi Corps appeared on the ridge to the south around 4:30 in the afternoon, and the sight would have broken weaker men. 4,000 warriors descended the slopes of the Oscarberg, their shields forming a dark river that flowed toward the mission station. They moved with disciplined precision, their war chants rising and falling like the heartbeat of some enormous beast. The ground itself seemed to tremble beneath their feet. The first attack came fast. Several hundred Zulus rushed the southern wall, their assegais raised, their faces set in masks of determination. The British rifles spoke as one. The crash of volleys rolled across the veldt like thunder. Warriors fell, but others took their places, pressing forward against the wall of lead. The Martini Henry was a devastating weapon at close range. Its heavy .577 caliber bullet could drop a man at 500 yards and pass through multiple bodies at close quarters. But the rifle had limitations. It generated tremendous heat, and after sustained firing, the barrel became too hot to touch. The extraction mechanism could jam when the chamber overheated, and there was the matter of ammunition. 20,000 rounds sounded like a lot, but against 4,000 attackers making repeated assaults over 12 hours, it would have to be carefully managed. By 6 o'clock, the situation had become critical. The Zulus had gained control of the hospital's outer walls, and the building was now the focus of the fiercest fighting. Inside, the sick and wounded patients lay in several rooms, defended by just a handful of soldiers. The attackers began to force their way in, stabbing through windows and doors, setting fire to the thatched roof. What followed in the hospital was a nightmare of close-quarters combat. Private Henry Hook found himself defending patients in a smoke-filled room, his rifle long since empty, armed only with a bayonet. Zulu warriors appeared at every opening, their assegais thrusting through the darkness. Hook fought them off in a space so confined that he could barely swing his arm. Meanwhile, Private John Williams hacked through the mud brick walls with a pickaxe, creating holes barely large enough for a man to squeeze through. One by one, the surviving patients were dragged from room to room, passed through the openings like cargo, while defenders held the doorways with their bodies. The roof was fully ablaze now, the flames casting dancing shadows across scenes of desperate violence. Some patients could not be saved. Their screams as the Zulus reached them would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. But most were brought out, carried and dragged across the yard to the inner defenses while the hospital burned behind them. By 7 o'clock, Chard had been forced to abandon the outer perimeter. The garrison retreated to a smaller defensive position around the storehouse. The walls now just biscuit boxes and mealie bags, arranged in a final redoubt. The hospital was a roaring inferno, its flames lighting the entire battlefield. And still, the Zulus came, wave after wave, climbing over their own dead to reach the defenders. The fighting now became almost medieval in its intimacy. The Zulus would rush the barricades, and the British would meet them with bayonets and rifle butts. Men fought hand-to-hand across walls barely waist-high. The crack of rifles gave way to the grunt of physical struggle, the thud of bodies, the wet sound of steel entering flesh. Officers fought alongside privates, distinguishable only by their revolvers. Ammunition was running low. Chard ordered that only aimed shots be taken, no more volleys. Men who were too badly wounded to fight reloaded rifles for those who could. Some soldiers fired until their weapons jammed, then picked up the rifles of the fallen and continued. The barrel of every Martini Henry glowed red in the darkness. Around 10 o'clock, the attacks began to slacken. The Zulus had been fighting for nearly 6 hours, many of them without food or rest since the previous day. They had marched 20 miles, fought at Isandlwana, crossed the river, and now spent hours throwing themselves against a position that refused to fall. Their casualties were mounting into the hundreds. Their commanders could not understand how such a small garrison could hold against such overwhelming numbers. But the attacks did not stop entirely. Throughout the night, probing assaults tested the defenses. Rifle fire crackled in the darkness. Men dozed, standing up at their posts, jerking awake at every sound. The hospital continued to burn, gradually collapsing into embers. The only light came from the flames and the stars, cold and indifferent above. Sometime after midnight, the intensity increased again. The Zulus made a final determined push, perhaps sensing that the defenders were near the end of their endurance. Once more the barricades became a scene of desperate struggle. Once more the bayonets did their grim work. Once more the line held. And then, around 4 in the morning, silence. The Zulus began to withdraw. Not in panic, not in rout, but in exhaustion and recognition. They had done everything warriors could do. They had attacked with courage and persistence for nearly 12 hours. They had lost perhaps 500 dead and as many wounded. And still the British flag flew over the smoking ruins of the mission station. As the first grey light of dawn crept across the veldt, the defenders of Rorke's Drift looked out upon a scene of carnage that defied description. Bodies lay everywhere, piled against the barricades, scattered across the yard, floating in the nearby river. The hospital was a blackened shell, still smouldering. The walls of mealie bags were riddled with assegai marks and stained with blood. Of the garrison, 15 men were dead. 2 more would die of their wounds, and nearly everyone else was injured to some degree. They had fired almost all their ammunition. They had fought for 12 hours without relief. And they had held. Later that morning, Lord Chelmsford's column arrived, having finally returned from its futile pursuit, only to find Isandlwana a field of corpses. The soldiers who marched into Rorke's Drift could scarcely believe what they saw. Exhausted men in tattered uniforms still stood at their posts, rifles ready, eyes glazed with fatigue, but still alert. Around them lay the evidence of the night's fighting, in testimony to what courage and determination could achieve against impossible odds. Chelmsford himself was stunned. After the disaster of Isandlwana, he had expected to find Rorke's Drift in the same condition, another massacre to add to the day's horror. Instead, he found a garrison that had done what his main force could not. A handful of men had achieved what thousands had failed to accomplish. They had stopped the Zulu tide. The news reached England within weeks, and the reaction was electric. After the shock of Isandlwana, the story of Rorke's Drift was exactly what the British public needed. Here was proof that British soldiers, properly led and properly determined, could stand against any odds. It was a tale of heroism that could be told and retold, that could inspire generations. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded for the defense of Rorke's Drift, the most ever given for a single action. Lieutenants Chard and Bromhead both received the medal, as did several of the men who had fought in the hospital, including Hook and Williams. The commendations spoke of extraordinary courage, of men who had held their positions against overwhelming force, who had refused to break even when all seemed lost. Some historians have since questioned whether the awards were partially intended to distract from the disaster at Isandlwana, to give the public a victory to celebrate rather than a defeat to mourn. Perhaps there is some truth to this, but no criticism can diminish what happened at that small mission station. The facts speak for themselves. 150 men faced 4,000. They fought for 12 hours. They held. The Zulu War continued for another 6 months. The British sent reinforcements, rebuilt their forces, and eventually marched on Ulundi, where they destroyed the Zulu army with artillery and disciplined volley fire. King Cetshwayo was captured and exiled. The Zulu kingdom was dismantled, its lands divided, its military tradition broken. Within a decade, Zululand would be absorbed into the British colony of Natal. Prince Dabulamanzi, whose unauthorized attack on Rorke's Drift had cost so many lives and achieved so little, survived the war. He spent years advocating for his brother's return and died in 1886, still dreaming of Zulu independence. His decision to cross the Buffalo River that January afternoon would be debated for generations. If he had obeyed his king's orders, if he had not sought glory for his warriors, the defenders of Rorke's Drift would never have faced their trial. History might remember January 22, 1879, only as the day of Isandlwana, a day of British defeat. Instead, the date carries both tragedy and triumph. The destruction of a column and the survival of a garrison. The failure of overconfidence and the success of desperate courage. Two battles fought within hours of each other that together tell the complete story of war, its horror and its heroism, its waste and its wonder. At Rorke's Drift today, the mission station has been restored to something like its original appearance. Visitors walk the ground where the barricades stood, trace the outline of the hospital, stand where Chard and Bromhead directed the defense. The Oscarburg Hill rises to the south, unchanged since the day the Zulu army descended its slopes. The Buffalo River still flows nearby, as it did on that January afternoon when desperate horsemen brought word of Isandlwana's fall. There is a memorial now, not just to the British who died, but to the Zulus as well. A tree grows at its center, an mpafa, traditionally planted on the graves of Zulu royalty. Its presence acknowledges that courage was not the monopoly of one side. The warriors who attacked Rorke's Drift fought with equal bravery, faced the same death, believed just as strongly in their cause. Their defeat does not diminish their valor. For the survivors of the garrison, the battle left marks that never fully healed. Some, like Private Robert Jones, were tormented by nightmares for the rest of their lives. Private Henry Hook struggled with the head wound he had received fighting in the hospital. Corporal Ferdinand Schiess, a Swiss volunteer who had fought with distinction despite a wounded foot, died in poverty just 5 years later, aged only 28. The Victoria Cross did not guarantee happiness or long life. But what they accomplished in those 12 hours remains. When all logic said they should have been overrun, when every calculation of force and numbers pointed to their destruction, they stood. They fought with bayonets when their rifles failed. They dragged wounded men through walls of fire. They held a line of mealie bags against the greatest warrior nation Africa had ever produced. The years have not dimmed the story. If anything, each generation finds new meaning in the defense of Rorke's Drift. It speaks to something fundamental in the human spirit, the refusal to accept defeat, the choice to stand when standing seems impossible, the discovery that ordinary men can do extraordinary things when the moment demands it. They were not legendary heroes when they woke on the morning of January 22nd, 1879. They were clerks and farmers and coal miners in uniform, men who had joined the army for a shilling a day and the chance of adventure. By the time the sun rose on January 23rd, they had become immortal. The Buffalo River still flows past Rorke's Drift, carrying its waters toward the Indian Ocean as it has for millennia. The African sun still sets over the veldt in colors that defy description. And somewhere in the wind that moves across that ancient land, the echoes of that night remain. The crack of Martini Henry rifles, the war chants of the Zulu, the shouts of desperate men fighting for their lives. And in the end, above all the chaos and carnage, the sound of courage refusing to yield. That is the legacy of Rorke's Drift, not a celebration of empire or conquest, but a testament to what human beings can endure when they choose to stand together. Against all odds, against all reason, against the full fury of 4,000 warriors and the darkness of an African night. The Martini Henry rifles that defended those barricades now rest in museums, their barrels cold, their triggers untouched. The Victoria Crosses hang in glass cases, their bronze patina darkened by the passage of years. The men who earned them are long dead, their bones returned to the earth of Wales and England and Ireland. But what they proved on that January night endures beyond any medal or monument. They proved that numbers do not decide everything, that determination can outweigh desperation, that when men stand together, shoulder to shoulder, facing the same darkness, they become something greater than themselves. They become the line that will not break. Centuries from now, when the British Empire has faded into the pages of history books, when the Zulu kingdom is remembered only by scholars and descendants, the story of Rorke's Drift will still be told. Because it speaks to something eternal in the human heart. The refusal to kneel. The choice to fight. The courage to stand when standing means everything. 150 men, 12 hours. One night that would echo through eternity. They held the line. And history remembers.